All right. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to do double duty here by admitting people and talking a bit. It is my pleasure to introduce to you our speaker today, our presenter. I have the good fortune to work with this person. Elisabeth Sikes works with me at the UIL Theater office. You probably have seen her at the state meet or at the UIL Film Contest or theatrical design. She definitely wears many hats in our office. But what a lot of folks don't know is that she was one to help develop this UIL Filmmakers Contest along with Luis Munoz, my predecessor. So she's very knowledgeable in filmmaking. She is a professional filmmaker, and she's also an adjunct in the radio, television, and film department at Austin Community College. So I'm very excited for her session called Film Pop Quiz. How do you get started? Ideas, assignments, and class activities to get rolling on your next short film. So I'm going to give it over to you, Elisabeth, whenever you're ready.
Okay, thanks. Yeah, so this will be my first time giving this lecture, although I have been lecturing my ACC students for 10 years. So it's been quite a while. Just a little bit of background. I have an MFA in film production from UT, so I definitely sort of approach my teaching material as if all of my students want to be filmmakers, although that is definitely not the case because I am typically teach an intro to cinema class. But I try to approach it as if everyone wants to become a filmmaker, because that's how I approach the material. I also was the director of artist services for 6 years at the Austin Film Society. There I ran a funding program for Texas-based filmmakers. So I spent many years giving feedback to independent filmmakers in the state of Texas, just kind of touching base on something that Chris mentioned in the last session. I was like, yes, like when he was like sort of talking about sometimes things are really like technically beautiful, but there's not really a story there. And that is something that I would find myself saying, giving us feedback sometimes to some of those filmmakers where I was like, you know, that is a gorgeous piece of cinematography that you've just done. Basically, you've produced something that's at the highest quality, like it looks like a car commercial, but we're not going to fund a car commercial. I mean, it wasn't a car commercial, but it was like, you know, that's really cool that you had a speedboat and a drone and a helicopter shot, like amazing. But if you're not using that to tell any story, then that at least was not what the funding program was about, and I think is not really what this filmmaking contest is about. So let me get started on my slideshow. Okay, figuring out how things work in Zoom. There we go, next slide. So I'm going to talk a little bit about kind of the elements and language of film that then will sort of feed into some assignments. And then when we get towards the end, I'll really get into some more like in-class activities and assignments. So just bear with me. Some of this is definitely kind of film school stuff. So if you've taken film classes, you'll probably be familiar with a lot of the concepts. And then even if not, if you're new to this, I always tell my students, and certainly would tell y'all, that even just as viewers of content, you know a lot. Like you know these things. Certainly your 13-year-old students are very, very well versed as a film audience of being able to watch material and understand narratives. They may not have developed taste quite yet in the projects that they're watching and really enjoying, but let's give you some language and then technique. And really, I always get super excited to kind of talking about film history because it's such a modern human phenomenon. Like 1895, that's when cinema started. So your students are participating hands-on in film history, and they're kind of the first generation that have the tools of filmmaking in their hands. If they have a smartphone with a camera on it, they can make a film. So let's talk about what is the language of film, because it is a language. Primarily, it's a visual language, but certainly sound. Sound is something that frequently in many student films, college on up, sound is kind of shunted aside, thought of later as sort of the last thing to kind of focus on, but it's such an integral part of being able to artistically tell a story. But let's get into it. So let's get into lighting. So lighting, of course, again, is more than just a source of illumination. It can really be used expressively to help tell you about the place that you're in, the character that you're in, setting up the story. It helps create mood, reveal character, convey meaning. So, right, like there are different approaches that you can go for with your lighting. So from a classic film noir look, I mean, this is so high contrast and contrasty. It is a silhouette. So again, would this be the appropriate visual style for your slapstick comedy? Perhaps not, but certainly if you're doing a crime film, go for it. Go for a film noir, why not? Or are you doing a low contrast look? Again, these are choices that are made expressively to get you into the space, into the character, and they should be used expressively. So a concept, of course, that comes to us from art, from painting, from drawing, from photography, ChiroSkuro, that really, really contrasty between light and dark, dark darks, black blacks, and white whites. It really focuses our attention on details, right? So this painting, I always kind of show this to my students, and I'm like, this is, of course, a classic example of chiaroscuro lighting as illustrated again in what would essentially in a film be a single frame, right? But the single frame is directing our attention. If you're watching something, this light is being used. And again, as a viewer of something, your eye tends to go to the brightest part of the frame. So of course, right here, reflecting her face and whatever is being said in this moment. We also have this little bit of illumination, of course, over here with what's happening at the table. Again, are you going to be standing in front of this painting or watching this film and focusing on what's going on underneath the table? No, right? It's black, it's dark. You're not supposed to be paying attention to it. Unless you are, in which case you need to light it, right? So I would say a good sort of technical exercise as an assignment would be to use something like that painting or a different photograph, or it doesn't have to, of course, be chiaroscuro, but very directional lighting, I think it's difficult to pull off, but it is a little bit more intuitive than something that's really sophisticated with multiple lights. But again, I think playing around with what lighting can express just through one single frame of film, what does that tell? So play around with that, build up your technical skills, because on a movie set, and this is like talking on a professional movie set, lighting is what takes the longest. It's a hurry up and wait sort of business. So typically lighting your set, lighting your actors, it is what takes the longest amount of time. And certainly I think in this world of Zoom that we're in, right, that you can see sometimes, I've been in big meetings before where some of my coworkers look like serial killers, right? Like they're in this dark silhouette, the framing is all wonky, they've got huge bright windows behind them. Lighting really, they're not serial killers, but lighting really sort of conveys some information. And so it's hard to achieve good quality lighting, but it's really such an important skill to shaping the visual look of your project. So, let's look at a classic example, and this is just exterior light. So from Terrence Malick, an Austin-based filmmaker, and his gorgeous, beautiful film, Days of Heaven, which he made in 1978, sort of the story, which I don't know that it's true because it's so impractical, but the story, and so I love the story, is that they really shot a lot of this film during the magic hour. What is the magic hour? If you haven't heard of it, the magic hour happens twice a day, at the beginning of the day at dawn and again in the evening at dusk, as the sun is either coming over the horizon or descending over the horizon. You get this beautiful, glowy, filmic look, right? I mean, this still image looks like a painting. So it's, your best Instagram filter right there. Like, go shoot in the magic hour, see if that's appropriate for, your project. Again, the reason why I think it's impractical for him to have shot the entirety of this film is because it's such a small window and every minute on a film set is costing money. So it's kind of impractical from a scheduling perspective, but certainly for student projects, for short films, go for it, right? You can do it. You can try it. And that's when people are learning filmmaking, the best way to learn filmmaking is to make films and to keep making films and make more films and learn from those mistakes, screen them for people. I frequently found when I was making short films that I definitely liked getting feedback from folks, but almost like more than getting written or verbal feedback, just sitting in a room with people who just have to watch my short film and seeing at which points they get squirmy, at which points they get impatient. Like that told me so much more about holding on to an audience's attention than almost anything else. So it can be very hard and painful, and this certainly part of the growing process as a creative person, as an artist, to be able to take feedback, to take critical feedback, constructive feedback. But it's, if this is something that students really want to pursue, then they're going to have to learn how to work within that time frame. And well, within that framework. And even if it's not something, if they don't want to become filmmakers, obviously being able to take constructive criticism is a skill set that will serve you well throughout the rest of your life. So we've briefly covered lighting. Let's talk about Mison Sun, right? So Mison Sun, I think you guys have that in the theater. I'm not as well versed in the history and performance of theater as I am in film. So Mison Sun, of course, comprises elements. Typically, I always think of it as the visual elements. This is one area that I would say in certainly some of the UIL films that I've seen submitted is not necessarily given a lot of thought to. Sometimes I've seen projects where it's kind of going for a horror movie feel, and they're clearly shooting in like their family homes, which is all fine, but it's like, I kind of remember there being like a horror film and, a door opens and behind is like someone's lovely wreath from like Michael's or whatever. And I was just like, I don't think that that's necessarily part of the mise en scène of that particular like moment in that film, because it's an interesting choice to have, your decorative crafts in your horror film. So if that's your choice, go for it. But try to make sure that it's intentional, that setting, the props, the costumes, the makeup. So just a few images, whether or not you've seen the Tim Burton film, Edward Scissorhands, this is from the beginning of the film. So already I'm going to have 3 images here in a row, kind of taking us into the world of the story, right? So already, you're getting a sense of, okay, the regular world is not all matchy pastel, but it's a choice and it's starting to create a feeling. And then there we go. And then we get a little bit more into it. Again, we see this very sort of idealized suburban environment. And then we meet our main character, who is a weirdo, and he does not fit into the world in which he lives. But if you can see his face, he's trying, like he's using his scissor hands. He's working with topiary, as you do. He's trying to fit into the world. And that's what, again, visually and from Mison Sun is helping to tell the story and helping to propel character and momentum in our story. So as a Mison Sun assignment, something that I like to do is I screen films in my course, and then I ask my students to pick one of the films that we've screened. So if you're not doing that, you could just say, pick your favorite film. Could be a TV show. We don't have to be strict about these things, but pick a favorite film and pick a character from that film. And this is the important part. We must never in that film have seen that character's bedroom, because I don't want a description of what they've seen on screen. I want my student to use their imagination from what they know about that character, what they know about the world of the story, and describe to me what is the mise en scène of that character's bedroom. Again, I've given them some prompts. I was like, you can use these questions as a jumping off point to answer, what does the bedroom look like? Or you can, I'm pretty open-ended in a lot of my things. I was like, these are a guideline. You don't have to answer all these questions, but it's just, again, sort of getting them to start to think about, you know, all of these things really should, in a well-constructed, artistic, auteurist film, they should be helping to tell your story. They shouldn't be making your audience step out of the storytelling experience, kind of notice something off in the background that's either distracting or seems out of place, unless, of course, that's the feeling you're going for. Okay, so we've briefly covered Mison Sun. We'll cover sound in very brief. So dialogue, okay, on a professional movie set, dialogue is typically kind of the only thing that's recorded, that and ambiance. So ambiance, or room tone as it's usually referred to, is something that you would record on set. So right now I'm going to be quiet for just a couple seconds. Okay, I don't know what you can hear on your end over my microphone through our live streaming setup, but I got the AC unit right behind me going full blast, so which is a terrible sound that I wouldn't want on my movie soundtrack. But it helps to sort of bridge. You do typically want room tone underneath your edited sequence in a film to kind of help bridge if you're adding in sound effects, or to bridge dialogue, gaps in the dialogue if you're picking from a different take, to bridge the music. It should help build the world, in this case, the audible world for us, the audience. Of course, in something like a horror film, I mean, the ambiance is incredibly important to helping create the paranoia or the fear that you're trying to build to your audience. So an assignment that I would say that I've seen done is, if you search for, as I have done, search for scenes from the German film Nosferatu, made in 1922, a silent film. It's a silent German vampire film. I think actually it's supposed to be the first vampire film ever made. It's a not copyrighted work. I mean, let me make sure I'm phrasing this correctly. I don't know whether or not Nosferatu is in the public domain or not. I do then know that Nosferatu is an adaptation that was not licensed of the Bram Stoker Dracula story. So they might have gotten into some trouble on their end back in 1922 about that. But you can watch scenes of it. It's a silent film, and apparently a number of folks have assigned that as sort of creating a musical soundtrack for a scene from Nosferatu. So certainly a lot of the early silent cinema, I think, can make interesting choices, and certainly some of these I believe would be considered to be in the public domain, like Georges Méliès's A Trip to the Moon. So again, you could use it as an exercise to learn how to layer in room tone, how to layer in sound effects. If you have, certainly I seem to have a real uptick lately in students who are really interested and motivated in movie soundtracks, in the musical soundtracks. So I would imagine that there are kids in high school that are like that as well, that might want to craft their own musical soundtrack to that. Again, the idea is just to kind of create a lot of opportunities for students to explore their interests and their talents, and maybe find a new interest and new talent, and really look at what is the difference between a song and a soundtrack, right? They can be one and the same, but usually they're different. That soundtrack is typically kind of underscoring the important parts of what's happening in the story or for our protagonist. So those would be some works that I would recommend looking at. Okay, briefly, we've covered sound. Let's get into cinematography, which of course is incorporating Mison Sun and incorporating lighting. So thinking about different types of shots. Do you want to do a low angle shot, which creates, it puts us, the viewer. So again, something that's, I think you intuitively, as a film goer, but perhaps you've never stepped back and thought about it. Intuitively, we, the audience, identify with the viewpoint of the camera. So Raising Arizona is not a first person film, it's not from a specific character's point of view. But again, by having a shot like this, right do I need to tell you, besides the shotguns, that this is a threatening, scary character, right? He looks really strong and powerful. Our camera is down low, so it's a good choice. A different type of use of a low angle, right from Psycho, our Bates Motel, the first time we see our big scary, well, I don't know if this is the first time we see, when we see our big scary Bates Motel, you know, don't go there. It's ominous, it's brooding, it's up there on the hill. We're at a disadvantage here. So again, a low angle creates a different emotional feeling or a different context for us. High angle shot. So Harry Potter, right? This is a moment of vulnerability for this character. We're in the position of power. So our high angle shot, the camera up high, looking down at our character, revealing that he's kind of in a moment of crisis here. So depth of field. So certainly, I don't think I can do this with my iPhone. I certainly love to shoot video on my iPhone, but so you wouldn't be able to do this with every type of camera, but certainly a number of higher end cameras where you do have the ability to play around with depth of field, right? So it could be done, you know, in this case, I would say this depth of field where it's shallow, where the background has gone into shallow focus, you know, might be done because in this moment in the film, I mean, of course, we have our centrally placed character here that we're already going to be paying attention to, but because, you know, I'm sure there's a light breeze going on in the background, the sort of movement of the trees, if it's all in sharp focus, if we have deep focus here, it might kind of distract and take away from what should be our focus this moment with what's going on with this central character. So it could be sort of a practical decision like that. It can be to really, again, kind of focus your attention on one person, but it's something that, again, on a professional film set, you know, do you want to go for a shallow depth of field that specifies a certain type of lens, potentially a certain type of film stock, or do you want to go for the classic of classics, like our deep focus photography, like this moment from Citizen Kane, where it's really, really a pivotal moment in the life of our central character in this film, little child Charles Foster Kane here, well centered in this window frame, and his parents, mother, nicely placed in the foreground of our shot, and the father a little bit further back. Again, the composition of the actors within the space is kind of telling us of like who's in charge of what's happening in this scene, right? The mother is making the decision that will ultimately change the course of the young boy's life. And he's kept, again, in this beautiful scene, he's kind of playing in the snow and making noise. So he's always a presence in this pivotal scene, and that's in part, you know, driving this choice for this deep focus, because really the whole film, it's called Citizen Kane. He's Charles Foster Kane. That's him, little kid, Citizen Kane. So it's his story. He's the center of it. But again, such an incredible moment of transformation that he's completely unaware of. And we get the sense of the dynamic between his parents, and then the context of this other leading character who will take us into the next part of the story. So then we, of course, have camera moves. I always, you know, sort of try to hit on the point that like a camera, the lens of a camera is the eye of the camera. So it's the audience's eyes. So certainly when I was in film school, there was quite a bit of hullabaloo about zooms, right? So zooms should be done with purpose and intent. The thinking behind that zoom, which I can't demonstrate here with my little rinky-dink laptop web camera, but zooms, you know, your human eye cannot zoom. I can't be standing here in my kitchen as I am and get a close-up of my shopping list attached to the side of my refrigerator. If I want to see it, I'm gonna have to dolly closer to my shopping list on the fridge to see what's there. So typically these other movements like dollying, tracking, tilting, panning, those are all things that you can do. And so they feel realistic for us, the audience, taking us through a space. Again, intuitively, we as an audience can identify with that camera movement. Again, a zoom can be done very, very well, very sophisticated in the right hands. In the wrong hands, can look like a cable access show, typically not what you're going for. So as an assignment that I like to give in my class, there are so many great like short film clips on YouTube, and quite a few of the ones that I find that typically stay on YouTube because they're not violating copyright is Fandango movie clips. They have lots and lots of these short clips. So they have a few different scenes from Sunset Boulevard, and I pick this scene from Sunset Boulevard, which is a great film by the director Billy Wilder. It's just like a 2.5 minute scene. And I ask them to do a shot list for this scene. So, you know, for this, I usually say you're going to have to watch it a few times. It's going to be easier to do it if you watch it without the sound, because we don't care about the sound for this assignment. I really want them to pay attention to all of the different camera setups in this scene early on from the film. So we're establishing this relationship between our two principal characters in the film. Now, of course, what they're doing is they're looking at an edited scene. So it's a bit of a cheat because there'll be a lot of reused sort of medium close-ups and that. But I want them to start to think about like all of the different camera placements and camera movements, because there are some very subtle little tilts and little dollies in this that are very nicely done. So it's a piece of classic cinema. So I give them in my assignment, you know, I give them the sort of shot list shorthand and tell them, you know, that it's usually all caps. Then I take a different scene from Sunset Boulevard, which is another one of those Fandango movie clips, and I give them my version of the shot list. So, right, I'm like, you know, part of the idea of a shot list is you're communicating with the rest of your crew on set about what you're trying to achieve there. It can help you storyboard, or your storyboards can help you generate the shot list. And I was like, you want to go into enough detail that everybody's on the same page, but you basically don't want a mini script, right? I don't need lines of dialogue, but I just need a sense of what's going to happen. So I like that as an assignment to really like make them really pay attention to all of the different camera setups in what's essentially a two-person scene. It's a very, very simple two-person scene, right? So many, I mean, so many things have two-person scenes, but to really like look at, gosh, they probably had like 7 different camera setups in this 2.5-minute scene. Again, it takes time and sophistication to tell the story well using film language. Okay, so that's cinematography in brief. Let's talk about editing. I did this last night and I was getting a little punchy. So when we get into editing, if you haven't heard of the Soviet montage movement, we're going to talk about the Soviet montage movement. That's where I was getting a little bit punchy. So editing, of course, the way it was done for decades and decades and decades of Hollywood film history was literally razor blades and tape, as we see in as this nice lady here editing on a moviola. And of course, everything now is done on computer. Again, you know, I'm like, even our sort of film auteur heroes who just are absolutely enamored with the history and love of film, nobody cuts with razor blades and tape anymore. So it's all on computer. So one thing to think about, so I have a few different kind of editing things to just plant as a seed, as a choice that can be made. So shot patterns can be used to sort of create a relationship, bring us into a story. Again, I have a number of slides in the next lineup here to kind of demonstrate this idea of taking us into the space of the film. So this is another Terrence Malick film, and this is the film The New World, which is a telling of the real life person who we commonly know as Pocahontas. So it's a telling of the real life story of Pocahontas through the lens of Terrence Malick. So this is from the beginning of the film. So I think we're in Virginia. So we're in the New World. We're in America prior to the colonists showing up. So we get a sense of our main character and the space that she's in. And we have lots of centrally composed shots here, cut against each other. Again, moments in time and just little close-ups, giving us a sense of the community that she lives in. Here's our bit of foreshadowing. What are they pointing at? What are they looking at? Guess what? Everything's going to change within our next shot. The color palette has now changed. The composition has changed. And of course, the entire life of her community is about to change with the arrival of these colonists. So a beautiful example of like how these different series of shots edited together, again, tell us a story without a narrator telling the audience what I've just verbalized, right? Okay, so here's where we get into our Soviets, who they have really interesting ideas. I love to poke a little fun at them because I think they're pretty self-serious guys, but they had really interesting theories that I think are fun to play around with and could make some fun assignments. So the Kuleshov effect, as we see illustrated here in these images, is this idea that Lev Kuleshov, that you could shoot this scene, right? This close-up of this man, and it's just, you shoot it and he has a neutral face. And his idea was same performance, like a same exact shot. What you cut the next shot of what, again, we, the audience, intuitively understand, oh, that's what he's looking at. We, the audience, create a third interpretation of what we're getting from his face. So his performance hasn't changed. The shot of him hasn't changed. But if we cut from this face to a child in a coffin, again, the idea is we, the audience, intuit, he's feeling grief. If we cut from this shot to him looking at soup, he must be hungry. If we see him looking at this woman reclining on a couch, he must be feeling romantic. Again, we're bringing our interpretation to the audience because, of course, cinematic acting, right, especially in a close-up, is much more usually contained. So much more comes across in a film close-up than you would get, from the back of an auditorium in the theater. So it's a different style of acting. Okay, so then we have our other Soviet, and we have one more. So Pudovkin had this idea that's similar to Kuleshov. So again, these are experiments that, why not? Why not teach your kids about this film history? Why not have them experiment with it? Because part of what I think, that all these early filmmakers are sort of figuring out is like, they're figuring out like, this is a new art, the art of using film as a language. And it took a while, it took decades for people to figure out the language of film and how to tell a story in film, what film can bring to a story that's different from photography, that's different from literature, that's different from theater. It's different. So his idea has to do with, again, similar, but just a touch different, the order of shots. So my photos are not great in this next series, so you're going to have to use your imagination while I'm telling you what the shot order is. So in his first order of shots, we have a man smiling. So again, right, it's not a big smile, but imagine he's really smiling in this photo. And then imagine that was framed in a way that it looks like it's pointing at him. So then our next shot is a gun. Again, we as an audience understand, a gun is being pointed at him. And then our next shot is now he looks scared. Again, my photos aren't great for this, but it's what I have. So that's one shot order. That's a very straightforward shot order. Makes sense. Well, what if you take these exact same shots and switch them around? So we have our neutral, tense, sullen looking man, gun is pointed at him. Now he's smiling. Okay, well, that's creepy and interesting. Right now, I've created some interest. I've created a different story, or I've at least created a different version of that scene. So shot order serves a narrative purpose. So again, a very simple assignment I would think would be to try and shoot your own Kuleshov experiment. See if it works. You don't have to use the same scenarios, but play around with it. And then if you like this, if your kids like this, let's go into Sergei Eisenstein. I'm not going to show you a clip from Sergei Eisenstein, but you can certainly find it. Here he is. I always love to show him because come on. We got to have fun with Sergei Eisenstein. Very serious guy, very talented filmmaker, piece of classic Soviet filmmaking, Soviet propaganda called Battleship Potemkin. And he has this whole multi-layered like theory of the montage of attractions and rhythmic metric editing, which is really in contrast in an interesting way to sort of the more Hollywood continuity style of editing that we as viewers are so accustomed to, is so seamless, does not draw attention to itself. Soviet theories of editing, certainly from this era, they're not about seamless continuity editing. They're about in your face, like here's the next cut. So again, I would say explore that if it's something interesting to you. So something that certainly I've done a number of times as a student in film, and I think is really can be really great way to learn how to make films. Again, this may or may not end up being something that you would submit to the UIL film contest, but like learn how to do this. And so I would say take a very simple story. You could do an adaptation of a fairy tale, take a comic strip, preferably probably something with little to no dialogue. So essentially kind of make a short film. And while you're shooting it, edit in camera. So, right, that means everything in your final film is the first take. And so you're not shooting as long as you typically would be if you're shooting multiple takes of something, because you're making that decision of when to stop hitting the record button, to stop the shot. So it really kind of teaches you some pacing and rhythm, as well as thinking about like, oh, you know, I probably need to visually vary my next shot because otherwise it's going to be a little bit jarring. So I've done quite a bit of that myself, and I found it really fun and challenging. And you know, it's a bit loose and can be really fun to see what people do with that. Okay, so an ongoing thing that I have in my class is that I have a pop quiz. I have a pop quiz every single class. And so my pop quiz, this is usually what I do in my intro to radio, television, film class, is I have like again, that's just a twice a week class. So you can use your own judgment about what might work best for your teaching situation. But what I do with my twice intro to RTF class is, you know, I have a double-sided piece of paper that's already like printed out, you know, with where they have to write in the topic of the week. These are topics that I've used in the past, and then it's numbered 1 through 10. And so I pass that out at the beginning of every class, and then I give them just a few minutes. Usually actually while I'm getting ready for lecture, they're doing their pop quiz, and then I take it back from them, because even at the college level, I can never trust that people are going to remember to bring that paper back with them the next time. And then I don't look at it like, right. For me, I'm like, the pop quiz is for them. You know, sometimes when we first do it, like the first pop quiz, they're sort of like, well, what am I supposed to do? And I'm like, you road trip destinations, just make a list of 10, you know, and usually they don't make it to 10, or sometimes they, you know, really gel with one of the subjects, but I just sort of do this. And then at a later point in the semester, you know, I put them into little small groups, and I'm like, okay, well now take a monster doing something boring, and he's also an accountant. I don't know, you know, like I make them just sort of, again, kind of play around with this. And then another thing that I do that I kind of like figured out a few semesters after doing this, because some people like love this and really like take off with it. And again, I don't I don't typically like look at what they're writing because I want them to have a little bit of sense of, I'm not making corrections. I'm not checking in on them. I really just want them to kind of get into that mindset when they come into the class of just like, blah, here's what I think. Here's what I can come up with. And then what I've done is when I give tests, which I spend a whole class session on, I do the pop quiz, and then I make my own copy of the double-sided pop quiz. And so when I get to that one class section where it's like, okay, you guys have to come up with something that happens in a telenovela while they're on a road trip, whatever. I also give them a copy of what I've done, because then I'll make sure that I do 10 for everyone. So they don't have to use anything on my list. They can use something off their list. They can, go in a totally different direction. Again, the idea is just get them brainstorming, get them like thinking about other things. Of course, you can come up with your own categories. And then last night I found a PDF that I had. I don't remember where, how, why I have a PDF of the writer's book of matches, but it had a lot of really great prompts in it. So I know there's a ton of writing prompt stuff out there, but they kind of came up with these sort of different, again, brainstorming. So they have situation prompts. We have some examples right there that I really liked. And so the situation prompts, again, are just a starting point, right? So each of these examples, an ant decides to take his revenge upon the man who stepped on his family. I mean, I love that as a starting point, but it's already sort of giving us, potentially, it's giving us a protagonist. That's okay. You can switch it around. Again, what I always say in basically every context in my class, I'm like, there are conventions of film, there are conventions of storytelling, there are conventions of film language. There's no film police. Like, nobody's enforcing that you have to write this story from the ant's perspective. Maybe you take that prompt and you write it from the man's perspective. Maybe he's mad at that ant's family. Again, just kind of jumping off points into thinking about some other stories. They also have dialogue prompts, which I thought were really interesting. I thought it could be fun, as a class thing, to have people collect quotes, right? Like, start eavesdropping in the hallways, grab snatches of conversation that might make an interesting thing to start building a story, driving a story. Another way to kind of think about it is, I don't know that this is still really popular. It really was for quite a while, these sort of 24-hour film contests. So frequently 24-hour film contest would have a prop and a line of dialogue that, at the start of 24 hours, all of the teams doing it would get, okay, your film has to have a banana in it, and it has to have the line at some point in your short film, I think you broke it, and you have 24 hours to shoot the whole thing, edit it, and come back at the end of 24 hours and have our little 24-hour film showcase. So again, that's another way to kind of think about this type stuff. I think constraints and guidelines can really generate some interesting directions for filmmakers, because I think one of the challenges of the film contest is that it is so wide open in terms of what you can do a story about, that it might almost be too much for some folks, where it might help to sort of shape it from a okay, well, here, now you have to do this in your film, go for it, and see what comes out of that. And then again, that same writer's book of matches had this interesting idea of okay, well, now we've given you 1,000 different prompts that you can use. You want to throw in some variations? Okay. And so they had all these variations of dice. So you don't even need to have 6 different variations. If you just have 2 variations, it could be, okay, you roll 1 through 3. Well, guess what? Your protagonist is a woman. You roll 4 through 6, your protagonist is a man. Again, you can play around with these sorts of things to generate ideas, but also sometimes I think that in student filmmaking, sometimes people get really kind of in their wheelhouse and really sort of laser focus, which sometimes that can be great. And sometimes it can sort of be like, well, let's look at telling other types of stories as well, to just kind of get them out of their heads. So Chris had an illustration that's very similar to this one that I use in my narrative structure. So again, this is really for a narrative feature-length film. This is really too much, I think, to go for all of this in a 7-minute film or a 3-minute film, but it's that idea of how a story is structured. So even in a 7-minute film or a 3-minute film, you can have a beginning, middle, and end of your story. And again, just sort of hitting on these points that come to us from literature, come to us from theater, come to us from film, right? You typically have an inciting incident, a catalyst, which drives our protagonist, our character, that gives them a goal that drives the story forward. And that narrative, the bulk of typically a feature film, act 2, depends on obstacles blocking, impeding our protagonist's quest for the goal. And then virtually every film narrative, documentary or otherwise, depends on a character or a person pursuing a goal. So another assignment that I like to do is, if you are familiar with the radio show This American Life, which has been on for a couple of decades now at this point, and they have amazing archival resources of all of their shows on their website. And so I ask my students as an assignment to listen to a story. So in my case, I have them listen to it in their own time. You could also do this as like everybody in class sits down and listens to the same story. And on the first listen, because this is a helpful skill set, I think, to build for documentaries, right? So documentaries typically might have hours and hours of content that ultimately gets winnowed down to a short film. And so what do you have to kind of have an idea of what's in that hours and hours of content, but typically you're not gonna do a word perfect transcript of all of that material if you kind of know like how your story is being shaped. So what I ask them to do is like, okay, on your first listen, I want you to try and do an outline, just an outline of the story as you're hearing it, because that kind of emulates actually how they produce their radio stories. They record their raw audio for it, and then they get a rough transcript, like very, very rough outline. And typically in that very rough outline of an interview that they might do, they circle 1 or 2 key moments. And then they might get down into the more like word perfect transcript and kind of like really figuring out how to construct the story. So I have some, these are a few of the stories that I pick for them to potentially choose to listen to. I haven't listened to them in a while, but I think that they'd probably all be appropriate for school age kids. They're all pretty funny. So Super Duper or Squirrel Cop love stories. So again, I just like them to kind of build that skill set of, again, some very simple stories and how they're constructed. Because again, with This American Life and with so many things, when people are really good at something, as Ira Glass and his team are on that radio show, they make it look really easy. I mean, all of these audio stories basically sound like, you know, a person sat down in a microphone and told that story exactly in the way that you're hearing it, which I guarantee is not the way that that happened. You know, there's editing involved, but it sounds just very conversational and very fluid. And again, I think building this skill set is really, really important for up and coming filmmakers. Okay, so working on your pitch, your elevator pitch. So another thing that I like to do is an in-class activity, and this one is actually usually the most fun thing that I do in my class, in my intro to RTF class, is I have them do a pitch competition. So in this case, it's centered around a television show, and the example of a pitch that I have for you is from a television show. Of course, you could do this for a film as well. So I have them pick content that already exists, right? I want them to pick something. I don't want them to make up something that they're pitching for this. I want them to develop their pitching skills. So I say, you know, pick your favorite TV show, and then you're going to, initially we're going to do, I do it in brackets. which I'm not a sports person, which this exercise has really demonstrated that like I don't totally understand brackets, but I break them into little groups at the beginning. Usually that's like a class of 36. So ideally it's groups of 4. Right? I think that's how brackets work. Again, this is where this part's always a little challenging for me depending. So they're in their little groups. And so this group of 4, each one will pitch to the others. And then it's just conversational, right? It's just a conversational pitch. Obviously, some people are going to be more shy and don't want to like do stuff in front of class, but like it's just basically kind of one-on-one. The other person that's hearing the pitch can ask some questions, give some feedback, and they decide amongst themselves who is going to proceed to the next bracket. So ultimately I get my class to like, you know, there's pitches and I kind of have 2 sides of the classroom, this side versus this side. They ultimately produce like 1 person from each set of brackets that go off, and those 2 people stand in front of the whole class and they do their pitch for their show, hopefully having gotten some good feedback from their classmates. And then I like to really kind of make it juicy by having prominently displayed at the front of the classroom. I buy all these like movie snacks. Like I buy the giant box of like Goobers and giant thing of Sour Patch Kids and a big thing of like movie popcorn. And I'm like, whoever wins the pitch competition, which is, I usually try by applause. If it's not clear from the applause, then I do like anonymous voting. And then I guess if it was a tie, I guess I would probably like be the tiebreaker. But anonymous voting on paper, and then we come up with a pitch winner, and then that person gets the snacks and they get to decide, do I keep the snacks all to myself? Do I share them with everyone? Do I share them just with my side of the room? It's usually fun. And so I also, frequently in my assignments, I like to give them kind of, okay, here's the assignment, here's an example, so that they kind of, again, know what I'm talking about, know where we're coming from. So again, a pitch should typically have, what's the story? Like, what's the setup? What do we need to know? Who is our central character? What do they want? You know, is there something preventing them from getting what they want? What's the risk to them, the situation, and why you want to tell it. So then I give the pitch that is the pitch for friends. So this is the pitch, which is, I mean, it's an okay pitch. You know, to me, it's not the best pitch in the world, but you can read it there. I'm not going to go through the whole pitch, but like in this just couple sentences, which obviously turned into a long running, hugely successful series, like it gives us who is the story about, where is it set, what are the themes, what's the tone of the piece, and what's the sort of takeaway idea, and in this case, your friends or your family. So a successful pitch. Okay, so another thing that I think is really fun, I actually have a poster of this at the UIL office, is this guy created this periodic table of storytelling. I know you can't see it that well. Here's a close-up of a section from it. So apparently, it's not just this. It's not just this image. So if you go to his website, you can see this periodic table of elements. You can also order a poster if you want, and you can click. These are all tropes, storytelling tropes. So you can click on Evil Twin, as I did, because that's a favorite trope of mine. And then it'll take you to tvtropes.org, where it'll tell you about the trope. So again, just another thing to kind of like throw at kids. So like, you need some inspiration, you need a starting point, here's a trope. Tropes, you know, are well-established things. Do a twist on the trope, right? Like make it more interesting. So another thing that I thought would be kind of fun, I haven't done this with the class, but I think would be a good idea potentially for your courses or for the kids that you're sponsoring is, do you have a production code, right? Let's go back in film history. Let's talk about the production code of the year is amorphous. Frequently, if you're like a Turner Classic Movies type person, you'll usually hear of like pre-code cinema, which is typically like 1933 or earlier. We're not going to get into that, but they had all of these things that were against the rules, right? You had to have a production code stamp of approval to have your film theatrically released in the United States. This production code is what precedes what will come later in the late 60s, the MPAA, which is what we have now, which gives movie ratings, right? So they had all these things. And so this is the era. 1930 is like the era of film, well, not film noir, but of gangster films, like gangster films being very, very popular. So you still had violent films, but within the world of the production code, whatever violent, if you're doing, 1930s Scarface, your criminal can be a criminal, you can be your main character, can be pursuing like violent life, but by the end they have to suffer for their thing, for their crime. So again, it's a 30s take on it. I sort of came up last night with, I was like, hey, here's my production code. It's not particularly well thought out, but I was like, one, sick of superheroes. And then this morning I was like, well, I did like Watchmen, and I'm pretty sure she had a cape. So already, like, I'm thinking of things where I'm like, I don't have to even enforce my own production code. Guns, I don't want to see guns in projects. I'm tired of it. I'm really tired of the trope of like somebody looks at a photograph and then it's like, I'm remembering something. I've done that in a film. It's lazy. Figure out a different way to get yourself into the past, or have a character remember a moment. And then, you know what, I was like, okay, I'll stick with the gratuitous or unpunished violence and blasphemy. So you might have your students come up with a production code, like what are some of the common problems maybe they see in, maybe you could watch some of those previous films that made it to state UIL and think, they can critique it, why not? They can critique those films and come up with some stuff where they're like, oh yeah, that's kind of done a lot. Let's not do that in any of our films this year. So it could be fun, or it could be restricted, or it could be community standards. It could be all of that. And so then my last few slides, because we're right at 2, but that's okay. Then I was like, let's get into it. Like, let's get into film history. I love film history. You know what? Let's talk about the different film movements. So briefly, I have slides telling you about, like, hey, this group, you guys have to do a silent slapstick comedy. Let's talk about Buster Keaton. This group, you have to do German Expressionist. Do you not know what German Expressionist? Well, now I'm going to show you some images. Cabinet of Dr. Caligari. You can watch it on YouTube. It's there. Nosferatu. I mentioned it. You can look it on YouTube, right? Like, you can dig into these things. What are the chief characteristics of German Expressionism? Right there. So again, it's a different way to tell a story. And especially like this early stuff, the highly stylized acting, people can have a lot of fun with that, right? Like, filmmaking should be fun too. It shouldn't just be drudgery or challenging. It should be fun. So German Expressionists, this group over there, you guys do Italian neorealist. What's Italian neorealism? It's pretty serious. It's sort of documentary style. There's some classics of the thing. Long takes, natural lighting, non-professional actors, not a lot of dialogue. Again, those are pretty good choices actually for filmmakers learning how to tell stories. This group over here, you guys are going to do French New Wave. That's like in your face filmmaking. That's like a little bit back to the Soviet auteur of like, we're going to draw attention to the fact that this is an artificial experience. You are watching the film, and we are going to draw attention to our editing choices. And then this group, okay, that's another film noir. I was like, this group over here, you're going to do film noir. You don't know what film noir is? Let me tell you. So I picked some. Obviously, there are more. Gangster films are fun. But I picked some that I usually teach in my class that I think are really fun, that people could build a whole story around, or take an existing story and build out of that. So that's, yeah, again, a little bit of film history for you. Why not have these kids challenge themselves? So that's it for my slideshow. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Yes. And I can talk.
Elisabeth, that was fantastic. Oh my goodness, so many ideas, so many, and some of these ideas, some of your lessons, I'm sure a lot of theater directors can relate to those. It's like, oh, we get the prompts and we do improv and things like that throughout the rehearsal process. Just a few questions. Any advice on editing software for beginning students?
Okay, so the industry standard are Macs. I work just with Macs, so Macs, I can't talk knowledgeably about PC, but I think, if you have a Mac, iMovie is pretty basic, but pretty powerful. So I like iMovie. If you don't have a lot of money, it's going to come preloaded on any Mac. Final Cut Pro that Chris mentioned is a good one. Adobe Premiere Pro is kind of more at the next level, like professional level. Adobe is, part of that whole Adobe suite. So I myself am not well versed in Adobe Premiere Pro because that came after my years at film school. So it's it's a little challenging in the sense of it's not immediately user friendly. You know, if you played around with Photoshop or InDesign, it's like I can do some real basic stuff in those programs, and then it's like I could do 5,000 other things that I don't know how to do. But what is it? It's not lynda.com anymore. I think it's LinkedIn. They have lots of really great like training videos. That's kind of how I've taught myself some of these things. Because the thing about software is it's always changing, right? Like when I was in grad school, the industry standard then, which then sort of diminished, and I think now is back as being the industry standard, is Avid. Avid is expensive. You can learn it, and it does become like easy, and I think is maybe a little bit more user friendly than Adobe Premiere Pro. But Adobe Premiere Pro, I think you can get it for both PC and Mac. And certainly has a lot of facility and use. I think Final Cut Pro would be a good one. Final Cut Express, if they still make that program. It's hard for me to keep track of all that stuff because it's constantly, you know, in his session, someone asked about like cameras, and that's like whatever, just like whatever laptop you buy, whatever camera you buy in 6 months, something like bigger, juicier with more options is going to come out. So I'm a huge fan of especially now, I'm a huge fan of shooting stuff on iPhones, on smartphones, because it's right there in your hand. It's so available and easy, and it doesn't have to be a whole thing. So to me, the tools of it are within your hand. If you have an iPhone or an iPad, there's a really cool program called Nizo, Nizo, which is sort of an emulation of Super 8. And you can shoot within the Nizo app. So it's using your camera on your phone or iPad. And then in Nizo, you can actually edit. And you can actually do a little bit. I mean, it's very, very basic editing. But again, the kids today, it's like you'd probably show them, and before you're even on the third screen, they'd be like whizzing away on it. A little more painful as an old lady, like figuring out how it works, but it's quite user friendly and easy. Yeah, and so Nizo, it's like you can just shoot a number of different things within the Nizo app, which costs like $5. I think it is only, I think, for Apples, though. I don't think they have it available for other smart phones or tablets. And then you can edit, you can add a soundtrack, and then you can export it to your camera roll. So then you could export it and post it on YouTube or wherever, or if you just wanted to, and it has filters on it that look like the old Super 8 stocks. So it's got a real pretty look to it, and a little bit more tools that are kind of fun to play around with. And then, I mean, I think I noticed on my iPhone that now iMovie is on my iPhone. I haven't used it on my iPhone. I don't know why I would use it on my iPhone, but that's cool that that's there. So, I mean, we're going into this world of like, yeah, in like 10 years, people are going to be editing feature-length films on their smartphones. It's crazy.
We have a question about what you mentioned, a tourist. Or yeah, what exactly is that?
Okay, so we love the French. Our French film critics. So in the post-war environment, post-World War II environment in France, we get this like bubbling up from the atmosphere of like the people who have survived and the artists of France. And so we start with these people just writing about film because they're watching lots of not just French films, Hollywood films. So we get these French film critics who start this magazine called Cahiers du Cinéma. And then from Cahiers du Cinéma, they start really like writing really coherent film criticism. And from this, they come up with this idea of auteurism, the auteur, that the film director is the auteur, right? So, and that when you're watching an artistically made film, it's an auteurist vision. You are watching like that director's vision of the film. Now, can you think of like terrible films where it's not an auteurist vision? Absolutely. Can you think of like, and then I always like throw out to my students, I'm like, well, you know, my one big feature film that I worked on was Miss Congeniality. I was locations assistant, which meant I picked up trash with my freshly minted master's degree. It was a fun experience. There's a reason why it was a one-time experience. Those days are long, 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 20-hour days for $100 a day. So, but I was like, the director of Miss Congeniality, I'm sorry, like, it's a fun film. Maybe you love that film. Maybe they love that film. It's a fun film. It's a fine film. Is it an auteurist vision? No. Guillermo del Toro, that's an auteur. You know, Quentin Tarantino, that's an auteur. Barry Jenkins, that's an auteur. Like these filmmakers who really are looking at all of those elements of film language and really, really synthesizing them, really using all of the tools that you can use to tell your story, to tell it artistically. So I'm a big film snob, and I always make fun of myself in my class for being a big film snob. So I'm like, auteurism is about, it's a bit about snobbery, but it's about vision, that film is considered to be a director's point of view, a director's vision.
Right, and it gets them exploring. So they start hunting and, you know, researching and watching those movies, and they'll gain some.
I'm always like television, which like I love television, right? Like we live in such an exciting age of like storytelling on television with like limited series. And I'm like, in television, the showrunner is typically the auteur. Like they don't call them the auteurs, but like they're the ones with the primary control over the project. So it's a little bit different. And I guess in theater, you'd probably say that the director, it's an auteurist vision, but maybe it's, you know, considered more collaborative with the cast. It's just, it's the Frenchies. They gave us that term.
All right. All right. Elisabeth, thank you very much, folks. I'm sure you're going to want to go back to her presentation, and we'll put the recording up. I'd give it a couple of days, as well as the handout. So we'll take her presentation and turn it into a PDF that you can access it. So anybody have anything else to say? I thought this was fantastic. And Elisabeth, thank you once again. And tomorrow we have a session, in the morning, we have a session on OAP, theatrical design, and film. We have the team from PSJ Southwest who are going to present on how they handle those three, you know, categories in the UIL theater division. And then we have theatrical design with Rachel Gomez in the afternoon, and we will end the day at 3 o'clock with Luis Munoz, who is the film contest director, and he will talk specifically about just the contest, the nuts and bolts, the rules, the categories, and I'm sure we'll have questions on digital animation and traditional animation and that fuzzy line between. And so we'll see you guys tomorrow, and thank you very much. Have a great afternoon. Thanks, y'all. Thank you, Elisabeth.